My name is Larry Rosenthal. I'm the director of the Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies. And this is our last colloquium of this semester. I would like to inform you that we will have colloquia next semester. The first one will be on January 27th here in this room at 4 p.m. And our speaker will be Kaz Moody, who is an expert on the far right in Europe. I would appreciate if everyone would check to make sure that your cell phones are silent. And today's talk, I'm pleased, very pleased about this, is our third colloquium on questions having to do with ISIS and radical Islam. Our first, Professor Albert Bergson, dealt with the figure of Sayyid Qutb, who was the founder of radical jihad in the 20th century. After that, we had Brian Fishman, who offered what I thought was an extraordinary and enlightening analysis of ISIS recruitment. Today, we are fortunate to have William McCants, who will discuss the political and theological underpinnings of the Islamic State. Today's talk is based on his recently published book, The ISIS Apocalypse, the history, strategy, and doomsday vision of the Islamic State. William McCants is a fellow at the Center for Middle East Policy and director of the Project on U.S. Relations with the Islamic World at the Brookings Institution. He is an adjunct faculty member at Johns Hopkins University and has served in government and think tank positions related to Islam, the Middle East, and terrorism, including as a State Department senior advisor countering violent extremism. In addition to his current book, he is the author of Founding Gods, Inventing Nations, Conquest and Culture Myths from Antiquity to Islam. So, if you will join me in welcoming today's speaker, William McCants.
Thank you, Larry. Thank you to the Center for having me. It's a pleasure to be here with you. This is the last week in my book tour, so you are either going to get the very tired version of my speech or the one that has been very informed by the whole tour, and I will anticipate all your questions. Hopefully it'll be the latter. What I want to do tonight is to give you a basic argument for why ISIS has been so politically successful. Today it controls a swath of territory that has a population ranging between 2.5 and 5 million people. It has established a government in the Sunni hinterland between Syria and Iraq. It has a war chest of somewhere on the measure of $2 billion. It brings in millions every day from oil revenues and taxes. It is able to make its presence known throughout the world. It took down a Russian airliner, carried out the attacks in Paris directly. Indirectly is able to inspire young men and women to carry out attacks in its name. It has so far withstood the efforts of a coalition numbering some 60 nations who have been trying to destroy its government in Syria and Iraq. This is a powerful group and that goes far beyond anything al-Qaida was ever able to achieve. And yet if we look at the last decade, and if we were to examine the group around 2008 or 2009, by the way, there's 2 chairs right up here. You are very welcome, please. I'll keep talking so as not to draw attention. If you were to look at the group in 2008 or 2009, you would be forgiven for thinking that this thing is really going nowhere. It had control of no territory. It was a successful terrorist group by then, but had really been pushed back underground, was no longer an insurgency. It didn't look as if it was going anywhere. Its own leaders in al-Qaida, bin Laden, his deputy Zawahiri, both believed that the organization had been a dud, and they were embarrassed by it. And they saw it as an object lesson of what not to do as a jihadist organization. How then do we get from that dysfunctional organization in 2009 to the behemoth that we see today? What happened in the intervening period? So that's what I want to offer tonight, is an explanation of what happened. And perhaps it'll give us some clues of how this thing ends. And then I'd be very happy to take your questions on a range of subjects related to the Islamic State. My basic argument is that the ideas that animated the group, they had been responsible for its undoing in its first incarnation. Those same ideas were responsible fundamentally for its success in its second incarnation. What happened? The political context shifted, and all of a sudden these ideas that had been total duds worked for them. They won by not changing at all. So what are these ideas? What's the formula? It is 3 pieces. I'll give you the 3 pieces, and then I'll describe them in detail and explain why they had caused the group to fail and then later succeed. The first ingredient has to do with state building. For Sunni Muslims, who are 9 out of the 10 Muslims you will ever meet, the glory days of Islam were the 100, 200 years following the death of the Prophet Muhammad, who founded Islam. This was the time when Muslims had been able to conquer a large swath of the Middle East and North Africa, South Asia, and they had established an empire that became the envy of the world. This empire was known as the Caliphate. The guy at the top of the Caliphate occupied a position he was called the Caliph, and he wielded supreme political and spiritual authority in early Islam. But over time, his authority was sapped. There were other centers of spiritual power that sprung up. There were other centers of political power that sprung up. Until by the 13th century, this figure was really a figurehead, ruled in name only. But different rulers still claimed the title, and the latest empire that ruled in the region, the Ottoman Empire, the last great empire of the region, its head claimed the title of Caliph. And when the Ottoman Empire fell apart after World War I because it backed the wrong side, and it was dismembered into the nation states we see today, the head of the modern state of Turkey did away with the office of the Caliph. He thought it was a religious relic. In many ways, this destruction of the office of the Caliph, which was functionally meaningless, had a profound effect on conservative Sunni Muslims. They felt as if you could not have a properly constituted Muslim community if you did not have this office at the top. And so they held a series of conferences to try and bring it back. And all the conferences failed because each nation quarreled about who would get the title of Caliph. But in many ways, this was the beginning in the Sunni world of the phenomenon that academics call political Islam, or Islamism. It really began in many ways as an attempt to try and bring the office of the Caliph back. For the more violent variety of Islamists, particularly the ultra-conservative kind, who are called Salafi jihadists, this is their main goal, to try and resurrect the caliphate. They want to bring this office back. They want to bring the historical Muslim world empire back. This is what they're fighting for. But they differ with one another about how to do it. And generally, for jihadists, the belief is that the caliphate is something that comes far in the future. That right now they're trying to establish Islamic State, or from al-Qaeda's perspective, it was trying to get the United States out of the region as a necessary prelude to establishing Islamic states, because they didn't think you could do it if the United States still had bases in the region. So caliphate later was the idea. This Muslim empire is going to come back, but we've got a lot of work to do now, because from the jihadist perspective, they were relatively weak to the great powers in the region, and particularly with regards to the United States. The Islamic State did not see things that way. It saw the situation in the converse. Its argument was that first you have to establish the caliphate, and then you go from strength to strength. Muslims are strong enough to do it. You create it in a small territory, and then you grow it. So it's exactly the reverse of the common jihadist wisdom. And so they set about doing so. They declared themselves the Islamic State and hinted that they were in fact the caliphate when they were founded in 2006. And they demanded that everybody else, all of the other Sunni rebels who were fighting against the Americans then in Iraq, they demanded that all the other Sunni rebels give an oath of allegiance to the state. Of course, the other rebel groups laughed, because this so-called state controlled absolutely no territory. And many of them wrote scathing pieces about, how can you claim to be a state when you have no land? It's a fundamental prerequisite for being a state. Much less, you don't monopolize violence, you don't provide services, so on and so forth. So they dismissed it. The Islamic State still nominally pledged allegiance to al-Qaida in secret. And al-Qaeda's leaders were ticked off that they had done this. Before the Islamic State was established, it had been known as al-Qaida in Iraq. It was a branch of al-Qaida, and it continued to be so. But al-Qaeda's leaders did not want them to establish a state. They told them, it's premature. First, you have to get the Americans out, at least of Iraq. And then, and this is important because this is going to be a main difference between the two organizations, you have to win over broad, public, popular support for your effort. If you don't, your state building enterprise is going to fail if you don't have the support of the public. The founders of the Islamic State ignored this advice, as they saw it, went ahead and established the state, and ended up alienating the rest of the opposition because they were insisting on being treated as a state. So first, that's the first part of the three-part formula. Caliphate now rather than later, and it seems to have been a horrible disaster because it made them a laughingstock and they alienated the other rebel groups. The second part of the formula had to do with how they went about establishing this state. The founder of the group that established al-Qaeda in Iraq was a guy, a Jordanian street tough named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who in prison, Jordanian prison, got religion and saw religion as a way to make up for his earlier sins. And he was a very charismatic figure, but also quite extreme in his views. He wanted to wage a very brutal kind of insurgency against the local governments in the region. And al-Qaeda's leaders, bin Laden, Zawahiri, saw him as too extreme for their own program. Again, because remember, al-Qaeda's leadership wanted to win over broad Muslim popular support. The infidel, they're not worried about. But in the Muslim world, they wanted to build popular support, and they believed that Zarqawi might tarnish their brand. So they were willing to coordinate with him, but they were not willing to join up. But when the Americans were making noises in 2002 that they might be going into Iraq, Zarqawi saw it as his opportunity to build this state that he envisioned. So he began to pre-position forces even ahead of the U.S. invasion. And when the United States came in, his group was one of the ones that was ensuring that any organization that was there that could have provided some stability, he tried to push them out. So who did he attack? The UN mission. Remember, it was bombed. He attacked the Jordanian embassy. He went after a major Shi'i shrine to antagonize the majority of the population. Why? He explains this in a 2004 letter to al-Qaeda's leadership. And he gives his reasoning as this. The situation is so dire that all the normal rules of warfare stipulated in Islamic scripture don't apply. You can circumvent any of the normal injunctions against going after non-combatants, going after Muslims, so on and so forth, because the situation is so dire. We have to wage a brutal form of insurgency, he says, in order to come out on top. And in particular, we need to go after the Shia, the other major sect in Islam. And it was the majority in Iraq. And we need to provoke them into an overreaction. And when they overreact and they attack the Sunnis will turn to us as a protector. So this was the basic game plan. He was applying in this letter for membership in al-Qaeda. And against al-Qaeda's better judgment, they signed him up because they wanted a hand in the Iraqi insurgency. And they didn't have one. They didn't have many assets on the ground. They had attempted to wage an insurgency in Saudi Arabia in 2003, which went disastrously for them. So against their better judgment, they signed Zarqawi up, and they immediately have buyer's remorse. And they began to send him letters just a year later in 2005 telling him, you're doing this all wrong. You're being too brutal. You're going after people who are not fighting on the battlefield. You are alienating everyone by these attacks. And in particular, Zawahiri, the deputy of bin Laden at the time, told Zarqawi, you've got to stop it with these beheading videos. They may thrill the young men in your organization, Zawahiri says, but they are disastrous for our public relations. Again, we are trying to win over broad popular support. You are alienating normal Muslims. If you need to execute people, do it, but do it off camera. Don't put on these bloody displays. Zarqawi ignored the advice and continued to wage this kind of campaign. Not only did he do it against the Shia, but he also did it against the Sunnis that he was proposing to one day govern. And his successor organization, the Islamic State, established in 2006, just a few months after his death, continued to do more of the same, going after normal civilians and trying to scare the hell out of them as a way to consolidate their rule. Again, it didn't work. It ended up antagonizing a lot of the locals. They were complaining to many of these people were members of tribes. They complained to their tribal leaders. And al-Qaeda ended up initiating a series of blood feuds with these tribes because of the killing. And this is a big part of the reason why there was a tribal uprising, the so-called awakening, in Sunni majority areas where rebel groups that had been fighting against the United States all of a sudden turned on the Islamic State because of this brutality. So again, it looks like the formula is not working. The state building stuff, not going well. The other rebel groups don't like it. They definitely don't like being killed. That's not good for cooperation. So the formula so far looks like a dud. The third and final part of the formula is what you can call apocalypse now. This is a bit more difficult thing to understand if you're not familiar with early Islamic prophecies of the end times, so I'll give you a little bit of a taste. Many of the prophecies of the end times are not found in the Quran. They're found in other kinds of scripture, a literature that contains words and deeds attributed to Muhammad. And these books number in the hundreds, stacks and stacks of them. Muslims will debate over their authenticity the way that Christian scholars will debate over the authenticity of the gospel. So it's that kind of literature. This literature contains a lot of prophecies of the end times. And these prophecies arose because of early civil wars in the Muslim community. When Muhammad died, there were a series of civil wars for about 150 years as Muslims tried to sort out who was supposed to rule after the Prophet died. And each time there was a civil war, the one side would come up with a prophecy of its eventual victory and the inevitable defeat of its enemies. And of course, the other side would do the same. And in order to give these prophecies some currency, they attributed them to Muhammad. Once the politics went away, this prophetic residue remains and could be picked up by later generations who weren't as aware of the circumstances that generated them, but saw them as applicable to their own times, much as the way that Christians sometimes will read the book of Revelations, which a lot of it has to do with the Roman Empire, but see it as applicable to today. Same sort of thing has happened throughout the history of Islam. These civil wars took place, for the most part, in Iraq and Syria and the Arabian Peninsula. So it talks about the end of the world coming in Damascus, in Ghouta, which is a place outside of Damascus, in Jerusalem, Kufa in Iraq makes an appearance. My point is that these are geographic place names that still exist today. So whenever you have major political upheaval in these areas, it invites an apocalyptic interpretation of events. Interestingly, most Sunnis, until recently, did not focus a lot on these prophecies. Medieval Sunnis did, but modern Sunnis didn't, particularly the upper class. They viewed speculation on the end times as something that the Shia would do, this other sect in Islam. They get worried about that stuff, but not right-thinking Sunnis. Or it's something that the riffraff would do, ignorant people, but not educated Sunni Muslims. Yes, the end times will come. Yes, the prophecies are true, but we shouldn't be speculating about when or why. That changed in 2003 with the U.S. invasion of Iraq, because as I said, when you have major political upheaval in a geographic location mentioned in the prophecies, it invites apocalyptic interpretations of events. And all of a sudden, the U.S. becomes a major actor in the apocalyptic drama. And in the Sunni world, there began to be much more interest in an apocalyptic understanding of events. We know this because books that had been published about the end times in the 1990s were total duds. Nobody was buying them. After 2003, they became bestsellers. So there was major interest in these prophecies. The Islamic State was born out of Iraq. It was born out of the invasion. And it's no accident, really, that its leaders were also imbued with this apocalyptic fervor. This fellow Zarqawi I mentioned, and his successors talked a lot about the end times and the appearance of the Antichrist and a series of cataclysms that would lead up to a final battle with the infidels. The founder of the Islamic State, a guy who went by the name of Abu Ayyub al-Masri, he was particularly obsessed with this stuff. And he believed that the Muslim savior figure, someone called the Mahdi, was going to appear at any moment. And that is why he rushed to establish the Islamic State because he believed this figure was coming. We also know, based on a complaint written down by his chief judge, we also know that he was making battlefield decisions on the basis of this timetable. He, in fact, ordered his lieutenants to fan out across Iraq in anticipation that they would win within 3 months because this savior figure was going to appear. And of course, he didn't appear, and they began to take real losses and had to retreat. But nevertheless, he was making some major decisions in the theater on the basis of these beliefs. So much so that al-Qaeda's leadership writes him a letter that we have in which they say, basically, knock it off. This kind of speculation, number one, no one knows when the world's going to end. And number two, it's just terrible for prosecuting a war. You don't make decisions this way. Pay attention to the battlefield and not this other stuff that's a product of your imagination. So this was another reason then why the Islamic State was faltering, was because its leadership was obsessed with this stuff and taking some bad decisions on the battlefield as a consequence. So those are the 3 parts of the formula. Caliphate now rather than later, apocalypse now rather than later, and brutality rather than hearts and minds. It seems to be a recipe for disaster, and it was. It was a recipe for disaster, so much so that bin Laden, in the years following, wrote several letters to his other affiliates around the world telling them, do not follow the example of the Islamic State. They've made a hash of this. Those of us who studied the organization, and even bin Laden himself, saw these things as the reason why the Islamic State failed. But there was one important piece missing. And that piece was the world's most powerful military sitting on top of the land that they wanted to govern. And it's something that we often elide when we think about why this group failed in the preceding decade. And we will point to the tribal uprising as the reason why it failed. Well, the tribes were able to rise up because they had a major military there to support them, to give them weapons, to go house to house, hunting the Islamic State's leadership. What changes in the intervening years is this military leaves. President Obama draws down troops, one because of political pressure domestically, and he had been elected to do that. 2, because the Iraqi parliament was also not excited about being there, so the U.S. military draws down. That gives the Islamic State some room to breathe. Then there is a civil war that breaks out right next door in Syria. And the Islamic State is able to take advantage of that too. They're also helped by the fact that President Assad in Syria was letting jihadists out of jail early in the conflict in hopes that they would inflame the uprising against him and give it a more sectarian and radical cast than it had previously had. So they benefited from the release of the jihadists as well. So here's how the 3 parts of the formula come into play again, and here's why it ends up being a formula for success this time around. Caliphate now, first of all. The Islamic State was the only rebel actor in Syria and then in Iraq that was focused on building its own state rather than overthrowing an existing one. Because they had this belief that they were in fact a state and they wanted to give substance to the idea, they focused on building a state, a government, in the Sunni tribal hinterland between Syria and Iraq. Now, if you're the Assad regime and you're thinking about who do I prioritize, who do I go after first, who am I going to worry about? You're going to worry about the guys that are coming after you in Damascus, in your stronghold, rather than the yahoos who are building a state out in the hinterland. And that's exactly what he did. All of the other rebel groups were trying to take over Assad's stronghold. They're trying to overthrow an existing state. The Islamic State guys were focused on building their own. And because of that, and because there was no major force on the ground that could oppose them, they ended up being quite successful in doing it. So this laser-like focus on building states that had been so disastrous the previous time around, because the circumstances did not favor it, all of a sudden circumstances favor it. Then the brutality. Why did the brutality then end up working for them when it had failed so much in the preceding decade? Again, there was no major force there to counter them. The U.S. military was not present. The Assad regime had higher priorities. And brutality, it turns out, is a pretty efficient way to state build. We tend to forget this. I know I certainly did. We have come to think that, when you're rebelling or you're trying to build a state, you have to build a mass movement to bring the people with you, and that's sometimes work, but it's often the case that that can be a really disorganized effort. If you're trying to bring everybody along, then you've got to please many different constituencies, and as a consequence, your decision making can be lacking. So other rebel groups then in Syria, like al-Qaida in Syria, called the Nusra Front, focused a lot on working and cooperating with the other rebels, but as a consequence, whenever they took over a town, they were inefficient in getting things done because nobody was in charge. And brutality then and iron rule turns out can be quite effective in scaring off your competitors and in subduing the population and getting them to do what you want, to stifling any kind of resistance. And the Islamic State is master at this. Before it ever takes in a town, for months, they will send in assassins who will rent an apartment, live a normal life, and they will send back memos to headquarters detailing who the key leaders are in the town, documenting their daily activities, and over time they will begin to assassinate those leaders systematically because they want to remove anyone that can rally the population against them. And after they go in, they quickly consolidate their control. They push out any other rebel competitors they may have worked with. And they begin to either co-opt or coerce the local powerful tribal leaders. If the tribal leaders are willing to play ball, they will give them a share of the spoils that will allow them to police their own people. If they don't, they will execute them. They will round up their family and execute them too. And if there's still resistance, they'll kill hundreds of members of the tribe. There have been mass executions of 400, 500 people of tribal members who resist. This has proven to be, sadly, extremely effective in building a state when there's been no one on the ground who can really oppose it. If you think about it, it's the same way the Taliban went about things and established its own state in the 1990s. Many other states have arisen in the same way. So brutality ends up working for them, where it had been such a failure in the previous decade. Finally, the apocalyptic stuff. The Islamic State's apocalypticism changes over time. It's something I'm at pains to document in the book because it's hard to see. But it changes in a subtle but very important way. So the early Islamic State believed that this savior figure was going to appear at any moment, and this was detrimental to their political project. Because if you believe a Messiah figure is going to appear at any moment and upend things, it can cause you to do stupid stuff. And if it's just any old guy that can appear, what happens if somebody declares himself this person? It can throw your movement into disarray. So the Islamic State changes its apocalypticism then, and rather than focusing on the appearance of a Messiah as a fulfillment of prophecy, they focus on the appearance of a state as a fulfillment of prophecy. They focus on the return of the early Islamic empire, the caliphate, as a fulfillment of prophecy, a return of God's kingdom on earth. And they begin to write a number of treatises saying that the caliphate is coming back, it fulfills prophecy, and there will be 5 just caliphs or rulers before this savior figure appears and the end of the world comes. What does this do for them functionally? What it does is, number one, it puts their political program on a more stable footing. Right now they're focused on institution building as a fulfillment of prophecy, state building as a fulfillment of prophecy. They're not worried about some individual appearing and upsetting the apple cart. But they also maintain this period of heightened apocalyptic expectation, which it turns out is pretty good at attracting recruits, especially foreigners. If you think about what it takes for a young person to leave their family and their friends and their job and to go overseas to a country they've never been to, the end of the world stuff can be a pretty attractive pool. I mean, imagine that you really believe that the end times are coming. You want to be fighting on the right-hand side of God when everything goes down and reestablishing God's kingdom on earth. And for a number of the people that have flocked to join the Islamic State, they have cited this as one of their major motivations. There's been one report after another of journalists interviewing foreign fighters transiting to or from the Islamic State who will say, I'm here because the big show is coming and I want to be a part of it. There was an interview a Wall Street Journal reporter did with an ISIS recruiter in Lebanon, asking him about this stuff, and the recruiter says, I think this is a quote, "The apocalyptic recruiting pitch works every time." It is a strong pull, and it's no accident. It's no accident that the organization's English language magazine is named after the site of where one of these big apocalyptic battles is supposed to happen. So they really emphasize it in their prophecy. Why does this matter? Who cares? It matters because they are the only group who does it. They're the only Sunni rebel group fighting in Syria who does it. And I think it has given them a competitive advantage then in recruitment of the foreigners that has enabled them to replenish their ranks. They've drawn tens of thousands of these foreigners to come fight for them. So it's been good for manpower. But it's also been good for the kind of insurgency that they are waging. This brutal form of insurgency, it turns out foreign fighters are very useful for this kind of insurgency. Why? Because foreigners have far fewer ties to the locals. They don't have any ties to the locals. They don't have family connections. They're not connected to the tribe. So if you need the shock troops that are going to come in and do the nasty business that you want them to do in order to create this fear that's allowing you to rule, foreigners are exceptionally good at it. So the apocalyptic recruiting pitch then is really good at attracting zealous people from abroad to go and fight and wage the kind of insurgency that you need them to wage. So, in contrast to the preceding decade then, the formula that had been just a disaster a few years prior ends up being a formula for success in Syria and Iraq because there is no major military on the ground to oppose them. So this focus on state building, the brutal form of insurgency and governance, the apocalyptic recruiting pitch, all of it has been instrumental in making the Islamic State the behemoth that it is today. So I will stop there and be happy to take your questions. I'll give you a minute to collect yourselves.
Thank you very much.
It's my pleasure.
Yes, we have questions.
Sure.
Please begin.
Are you looking at me?
I am.
Okay. I was wondering how the ordinary Sunni, who is very conservative, like in Saudi Arabia, the Salafi, do you think they are behind them, or because they are surrounded by families they are not?
That is a good question. So it is tough to do opinion polling in Saudi, as you might guess. But the best polls I've seen say that the Islamic State enjoys only 5% support in the population, which is surprising to me. I would have thought it would be a little bit higher, and it's higher in some other Muslim countries. But 5%, look, ISIS does not poll well across the board, but that's particularly low. One wrinkle, though, is that a number of young people in Saudi are very excited about the Islamic State, even though it's a small minority. They represent a big chunk of the foreign fighters who've gone to the Islamic State, and they probably have the most prominent presence on Arabic Twitter of any of the Islamic State supporters. So there is some sympathy there. And just to drill down your question a bit, the Islamic State's theology is no different from the theology that you find in Saudi Arabia. When the Islamic State took over Raqqa, which is a city in eastern Syria, and it needed school textbooks, it didn't have any on hand, so it used Saudi school textbooks that you can find online. So ideologically, they're very similar. There's some important differences in their political ideologies, but in terms of theology, they're very, very close.
Robin?
Yeah, in terms of the foreign recruits and the apocalypse, I've been hearing that the Chechnyan recruits play a really important role, and I don't know whether they were recruited based on this apocalypse or some other demons that come with them from their own territory. And
Yeah, for the Chechens, I don't think it was the apocalyptic recruiting pits so much as, many of them have just spent decades fighting now, and Russia has been actively pushing them out. Some say with FSB support, their intel services pushing them out into Syria. But they often come with their families. So in many ways, I think it's, for a number of those fighters, it's become a livelihood at this point.
Martin?
Tell me what you think is the underlying strategy for the tactic of using the violence in Europe or the United States for this, given what you just said, the violence being more on a particular kind of area in the Middle East.
Right, so this is something those of us who work on ISIS have been grappling with. Why are we seeing this uptick in violence in Europe? There's a couple of competing theories. I will give you mine, but I can run you through the other ones as well if you like. I think if you look at the timing of when these plots were set in motion, like the Paris attack, which we know was coordinated from the Islamic State, from ISIS Central. The timing goes back to the months immediately following the decision to begin to bomb ISIS territory. And I think from the Islamic State's perspective, they wanted to build a foreign operations capability in order to strike out and strike back at its adversaries in the West. And so, already within a few months after the bombings, the Abaoud, who coordinated this attack in Paris, was already networking with cells that he had helped set up in Europe. So I think that's what's happening. And I think the pace of these attacks, regrettably, increases as the Islamic State's territory shrinks. I think of the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq as a government. And if you are a weak state, terrorism is an attractive tool, absent any other more conventional means of waging war against your enemies. And I think the tempo of these attacks will continue to increase as their territory shrinks. One, as retaliation, but two, also for recruitment as well. Now, there's another strain of thought that says that this is designed to goad the West into committing an overwhelming amount of force to the region. And the argument runs that ISIS is seeking to provoke this cataclysmic showdown at the very least in order to recruit, and at most because they actually believe this stuff, and without getting in their heads, we don't quite know. But if the Allies commit overwhelming ground force, the thinking goes that it will alienate the Muslim population, who will be more eager to rise up against them. They'll be able to recruit as a consequence. It will bleed the resources of the West. And ultimately, they will have to stand down. It is tough to know which of these it is without getting into the minds of the people who did it. One day we will know, hopefully. We will have access to some of these internal deliberations. But I'm mindful of what happened after 9/11. After 9/11, we were not exactly sure why al-Qaida did what it did. And if you'll remember, in the few months afterwards, bin Laden wouldn't even claim the attack. She praised it, but made it sound like someone else did it, even though we were certain he had done it. It was about a year later, a reporter in Kabul working for The Atlantic busted his laptop when driving on a rocky road outside of Kabul. So he needed a new laptop, and he goes to a computer repair shop and seeing if he can get his laptop repaired. And then the guy who runs the shop says, oh, hey, I don't know if you're interested, but, I used to fix al-Qaeda's computers before they sent out of here, so I got a couple of those if you want one. And the guy's like, oh, yeah, okay, I'll take it. So he bought a couple of these computers, and it turns out they had a lot of memos on them between bin Laden and Zawahiri and some other people. And one of these letters was written by bin Laden to Mullah Omar, the head of the Taliban, in October of 2011, right after the attack. And he's explaining why they did it. And the reason I bring it up is their explanation contains both of the explanations I just gave you. It's the letter says, in the first instance, we hope these attacks will convince the West to get out of the Middle East completely. Because in bin Laden's mind, he had seen what the Hezbollah had done to the United States and Lebanon in the early 80s, and he was hoping for that kind of outcome when Reagan pulled out the troops as a consequence of the bombings. But he said, if that doesn't work, then we hope the Americans go all in with a major ground invasion, because then we can grind them down like we did the Soviets in Afghanistan. We'll bleed their financial resources. We'll inflame Muslim opinion against them. We'll be able to recruit as a consequence, put pressure on their allies, so on and so forth. And then eventually they're going to have to get out. So one way or the other, we're going to get them out. So he offered both rationales, which, just goes to show it's tough to understand the decision making from the outside unless you have good evidence of their actual deliberations. Incidentally, al-Qaeda was really annoyed initially with how the Americans chose to respond to the 9/11 attacks, because we didn't go in with a large invading force. We went in with air power and special forces and worked with the local, the Northern Alliance to push out the Taliban. So they didn't get the big propaganda victory of the U.S. going in, but they didn't convince the U.S. to go out either. They were much happier when the United States made the decision in the years following to really build up forces in Afghanistan, but they were particularly excited about the U.S. decision to go into Iraq.
Apropos of Martine's question, is there any systematic way you can distinguish between the men and women who go there and become parts of the state, and the ones who stay in Europe or stay in the USA and do attacks in these foreign countries? Is there any systematic distinction between those people?
Well, the distinction had been, and this is going to sound like a dodge, but it is not. The distinction had been that those who went were able to go. right? And that sounds like it sounds like so obvious it's not to say, but the Islamic State had been trying to attract people to come and build the state. It had not been encouraging people to stay. If you can come. If you can't, then you may carry out attacks at home. They seem to have changed their thinking. There was an interesting report in the Daily Beast 2 weeks ago. Michael Weiss interviewed an ISIS defector and asked him about the appearance of ISIS having changed its strategic orientation globally and why that might be the case. And this guy said that there had been such a high rate of attrition among the foreign fighters who went to Syria and Iraq that the leadership had made the decision to start telling prospective foreign fighters to stay home and build cells because it would be a more efficient use of manpower rather than having them come to Syria and Iraq and become cannon fodder.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please, go ahead.
No.
Go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for a really lively talk. I'm wondering, the big question that seems to animate this is how did this group that wanted to create a state who couldn't do it in 2009 become able to do that today in the state we see? And then sort of the explanation goes back to Islam.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, it doesn't deal much with regular sort of analyses based on political economy or sort of history as I might have known it as an outside observer,
Mm-hmm.
specifically dealing with the Ba'ath Party,
Mm-hmm.
right? It seems like what happened is we had a bureaucracy out of power that was looking for a region with no authority
Mm-hmm.
or limited authority, and they could apply an ideology. You know, it was a secular organization prior to its kind of excommunication from the Iraqi state. So why all the dependence on Islam,
Mm-hmm.
and why not a dependence in the explanation on, you know, just other more practical forces, and kind of doesn't that overemphasize what Islam is doing?
Well, that's not my argument. My argument is that the political circumstances changed, and the absence of a major military to confront this organization is what was determinative. The ideas I talk about do draw on Islam, but I would note that the other Sunni rebel groups fighting in the theater are equally imbued with an Islamic ethos, but made different decisions and organized themselves according to different ideas, right? The apocalyptic stuff, the caliphate stuff, that's available for anybody to take up, but they didn't. So it's unique to this particular organization, and you know, my own particular training is as a historian of ideas, and this is one of the few times I think in history that you can see the power of ideas to shape a political context when it turns and is more favorable to those ideas. That said, the Baathists, the former members of Saddam Hussein's military and intelligence apparatus, have been instrumental in the success of this organization. There is no question. But the thought is, often that lies behind that, the question is that, you know, these guys are cynics, right, who are using the religious stuff in order to basically reconstitute Saddam's state. I'd offer a few thoughts. One is that many of these officers, the Sunni officers, came up through the ranks in the early 1990s when Saddam Hussein was strongly emphasizing Sunni identity, religious identity, as a counterweight to the Shia uprising. So beginning in 1993, he was really pushing it in the officer corps. If they did not get religion then, many of them got it in U.S. detention camps where they were heavily indoctrinated by the jihadists they were rubbing shoulders with in the camps, one of which, incidentally, is the guy who currently runs the Islamic State. A final thought I would offer you is that most of these guys who followed Baghdadi up the ranks of the Islamic State and are now his chief lieutenants, many of them joined the organization in its earlier days. They came on board when it was al-Qaida in Iraq, before it was even the Islamic State. They could have chosen any of the other rebel groups to fight with. They self-selected into the most religious of those groups. All of the groups fighting in Iraq in the last decade, if they're Sunni, they had membership from the previous regime. So it's not the overwhelming factor then in determining the success of the Islamic State vice the other groups, because all these other groups had them. What the Islamic State, I think, was able to do was, because of its ideas, was able to organize them and use their talents better than these other groups. And I would say particularly the emphasis on state building and the decision to wage a brutal insurgency rather than a hearts and minds campaign, the former Saddamists were especially suited for, right? These are guys who had run an authoritarian state. They have spent the past decade fighting a brutal insurgency. These are the guys you want running that kind of operation, and I think it's given them a major edge then in the battlefield. But I would not want to say that that their presence alone explains the success. I think there's a lot of other things going on that combine to explain the success.
Go ahead.
What about the success of the recruitment in Europe? Or, so I'm French, and so the attacks were done by people who are French. So they went to school, they had the same education that I did. How do you explain the success of just recruitment? Do they use like a different strategy to recruit in Occidental Europe, or
Right.
how does that work? Is it just like a symptom of, I don't know, like a crippling state in like in France, or underprivileged society? Like, I don't know how it works. I don't know how.
Right. So let's see. I have three things I want to say. Hopefully, I will remember all three. The first is that the recruiting pitch that they use is pretty similar no matter what audience. The Islamic State, in contrast with al-Qaida, attempts to polarize public opinion and to recruit from the extreme minority that results. Al-Qaida, recall, is trying to build broad popular consensus. That is not how the Islamic State does it. You don't light a fellow Sunni Muslim on fire in hopes that you're going to win over broad Muslim support for your cause. They do these actions deliberately to polarize. Now, how that ends up playing in Europe is that in many ways, it is a countercultural movement. It is the most countercultural you can possibly be. It is counter to your parents' Islamic identity, and it is counter to the prevailing culture in European states. And if you're a young person who is looking to rebel, there are few things as rebellious, as counter to the prevailing culture, as joining up with the Islamic State. And I often think about it in comparison with how neo-Nazis recruit in Europe. I mean, this is another group who has a vile ideology, thoroughly discredited, and yet they still attract people to their cause. And part of the appeal is that they are such pariahs, and they embrace their pariah status as a way to recruit. There's a third thing, and you said you're from France? Okay, so don't get mad at me for saying so. But we've been doing research at Brookings looking at the rate of foreign fighter recruitment and attacks based on per capita Muslim population in the Middle East, but also in the West. And here is the finding. And I cannot explain it to you really. I have an idea, but it's going to sound odd to you. The finding is that if you are from a Francophone country or a former French colony, the association with the higher rate of attack and foreign fighters is really strong. I can't quite explain why that is, and perhaps it has to do something with the tradition of laïcité and the way that the French go about dealing with non-French cultures. I don't know, but nevertheless, I just throw that out there for your consideration.
I am intrigued with an aspect of your talk about the ability of ISIS to arise, in the changed political situation that in part is based on the withdrawal of American forces. That seems to be at the very least critical.
Mm-hmm.
But as you said, there was a lot of pressure on Obama. It was but I think a part of his reluctance to go back in is in fact consistent with the other side, with ISIS waiting for having the devil there in force again. And so I'm seeing this tension. But at the same time, it seems like the predominantly the Iraqis, certainly not the Syrian opposition, is unable to generate their own power to which they theoretically should be able to do, but they gave up all this equipment, they gave up all the training, and they just evaporated.
Right.
And I'm wondering where do we go to get out of that kind of
right. So
shadow
yes,
boxing?
you are right. And so here's the challenge for President Obama. The United States is doing most to destroy the ISIS government in Syria and Iraq, and it presents the least threat to the American homeland. It presents a far greater threat to the countries in the neighborhood, and then in a second order to Europe. But for the countries in the neighborhood, they all have higher priorities than the destruction of the Islamic State. So it makes it very difficult then for the Americans to find a partner to work with on the ground. And let me just go around the horn to explain what I'm talking about. Turkey, right? Gigantic army, NATO ally, very capable. Not so worried about the destruction of the Islamic State. Why? Because it's more worried about Assad, and it's much more worried about the Kurds. It does not want the Kurds establishing a state in northern Syria on its territory. And it's a big reason why when the ISIS guys showed up in Turkey at the airport, they were just waving them through. So it worries the Turks, but not as much as it does us, right? It's a lower priority. Look at the Kurds. The Kurds are worried about ISIS only insofar as it impinges on their own state building in Kurdish majority areas, either in Iraq or in Syria. So they, again, are not too anxious to go into Sunni-dominated areas, which they can't hold for long anyway. Then we get to, if we keep going around, we get to Baghdad. The government in Baghdad was freaked out when ISIS took over Mosul. But they believe that they have firewalled the Shia majority areas of the country, and there is not the same sense of urgency that there was a year or so ago, which is one reason why they haven't pushed so hard to retake those areas in the Sunni majority part of the country, because they don't really know what forces they're going to be left behind. They are going to leave behind in order to take them and take and hold the territory. Keep going around. Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is far more worried about Iran than it is about ISIS. How do we know this? Because all of its forces are engaged in a war in Yemen against what it sees as an Iranian proxy. It has not flown a single sortie with the allies against ISIS in 3 months. Again, it worries about ISIS, but it's down list of priorities. And then, as I also already said, with regards to Assad, it's a lower priority for him. It's not to point the finger, it's just to show that there is a major misalignment between what we think is the big problem and what everybody else in the region thinks is the big problem. And until there's an alignment between those things, you can't really make a lot of headway. The current strategy is not going badly if you're talking about the destruction of the ISIS state in Syria and Iraq. It's lost 25% of its territory. It's lost tens of thousands of its fighters. That will put a gigantic strain on its coffers. It raises most of its money from taxes, so if it has territory taken away, it's harder for it to pay the bills when it's prosecuting this type of war. it will be under greater and greater strain. The challenge is, as you allude to, we don't yet know who goes in and provides stability and governance once those areas are liberated. It's the main part of the current strategy to strangle the Islamic State.
The back.
Just as a follow-up, I'm asking a speculative question. Do you have any speculative thoughts as to future trajectories or future scenarios?
For the Islamic State?
Yes.
Well, there's the more reasonable ones, and then there are the outlandish ones. So the reasonable ones are that it just relocates its assets and its people to other places where it controls territory. So one way to think about all of these provinces that it's building in other countries is that they're lifeboats for the organization. If they lose ground in Iraq, they can relocate to Libya, or they can relocate to Yemen, and so on and so forth. The more outlandish scenarios are that it tries to do something really daring, and perhaps even invoking the prophecies, again, either out of belief or to at least recruit on its basis. A big part of the apocalyptic scenario is going to Mecca and meeting this Muslim savior figure. An incursion into Saudi Arabia would be huge for the jihadist movement, and ISIS has been competing with al-Qaida for recruits. A strike against Saudi would rank pretty high on the list of priorities. The Saudis would probably be able to handle it, but it would be very destabilizing to the regime, which then, of course, is connected to world energy markets. And they're undergoing a succession, I don't know if crisis is yet the right word, but it's an unsteady transition. So, the ISIS could try then a Hail Mary like that in order to further destabilize the neighborhood and provide it with more areas to operate if it's squeezed in Syria and Iraq.
Please.
I was struck as you were describing the sort of decision-making that bin Laden was, post facto going through, or the way it turned out he was thinking about it. And it strikes me that actually it's not as you perhaps suggest, it's not necessarily an either or. Mm-hmm. He's basically saying, we do this.
Yeah.
Either they pull, either way we win.
Right.
Either we scare them and they leave the region,
Yeah.
or we provoke them to go in
Yeah.
and we win.
Right.
And it seems like it's exactly the same dilemma
Mm-hmm.
in the recent Paris attacks that Hollande is facing. They're clearly targeting countries right when they enter. So there's this sort of there is on one thing that could happen is there is countries get afraid of entering in this coalition.
That's
because
right.
They don't want to.
They don't want to be a target.
They don't want to be Paris the next time. Or if that doesn't happen, you incite Hollande, as they successfully did, to up the ante and then whatever it does in the region, it certainly foments the kind of animosity that they need for recruiting in France. And so it seems like it's that same sort of either way they win strategy. And so then, what do you tell Hollande to do in that case?
Well, that's why I don't think the current strategy is that bad, because it is not going all in and it is not pulling all out. It is frustrating because it is neither nor, but it also avoids some of the major pitfalls. And I would say one of the big downsides of going all in, despite those that have been, in addition to those that bin Laden listed, is that if you go all in with a major occupying force, one, we tried that before and it didn't quite work in getting rid of these guys, but two is that you take the local leaders in Syria and Iraq off the hook for making the difficult political compromises they are going to have to make in order to sap the energy of the popular disaffection among the Sunnis that is driving all this stuff to begin with.
To me, one of those startling things you said was the relative indifference in the area to the threat that's posed by ISIS, given the near hysteria that we're experiencing.
Yep.
And also, it seems to me, one of the implications when you talked about the firewalling of Shiite Iraq and the boundary creation of Kurdistan and stuff like that, would it, and given one of your main theses, which is the fact that this represents itself as a sovereign power, not just a war-making organization that's dispersed structure, what would be the consequences of creating in the Sunni majority areas of Iraq and Syria, whatever, a rival state?
Yep.
That, I mean, that somehow or other could present itself to the world. It seems like this was the solution to many of the problems to begin with. When you look at an ethnic map of the region, the state boundaries were all in the wrong place anyway. Could this perhaps facilitate the creation of ethnically bounded states that are more secure and more stable?
I mean, you can't dismiss it out of hand, because in some ways that's functionally what's happened. I mean, at the very best, you can imagine some sort of confederation in the future. I mean, until very recently, the government in Baghdad was still paying salaries for government employees living in ISIS land. They finally had to cut it off because that was going to fund the state. But nevertheless, they were already treating it as a semi-autonomous area. I guess the challenge is if there is a state built in that area, and it's either ISIS or someone else that controls it, the challenge is that it's pretty resource poor. And so how does it sustain itself as a state? And part of the reason why Anbar is in rebellion is that they don't feel like the central government is doing enough to give them a share of the oil. And if that is their big part of their state, how is it sustainable? So I guess that would be the big challenge then for having a Sunni stand in that area.
Go ahead.
Yes. Following his speech at the United Nations, the Russian President Putin presented himself to the world as the knight in shining armor, finally stepping into the fight, and finally sort of shouldering upon himself the responsibility of dealing with ISIS.
Right.
Accused the West of dithering, not doing anything.
Yeah.
What do you think is behind the relationship, potentially, between the Russian strategy in Syria, northern Iraq, and ISIS? What is ISIS's relationship to Russia, and perhaps Russia's relationship to ISIS?
Okay. I would have had an easier time answering this 6 weeks ago, and I will tell you why it's become complicated since then. But Russia's basic strategy has been the same as Assad's strategy, right? Which is to try and take on anybody that represents a real threat to the regime. So ISIS doesn't represent a real threat because it's focused on state building far away. Whenever it gets close, starts to push into Damascus, Assad starts to bomb, Russia starts to bomb. But in general, most of the firepower is falling on rebels, the Sunni rebels, that pose an immediate threat to the regime. The attack on the Russian airliner and the killing of over 200 civilians, Russian civilians, in Egypt by an ISIS affiliate, you might think that it would push the Russians to get more serious about dealing with the ISIS problem in Syria and Iraq. So far, it has not. And I think they have a limited amount of firepower that they can bring to bear on the problem, and I think their main priority still is the protection of the Assad regime. So they have to do a little bit to continue to present themselves as the counter-terror force, as you the knights in shining armor, as you say, but only to a point. If you look where they're dropping bombs, you see what their priorities are. Now, The ISIS part of your question is what's complicated for me, and I am unsure of. There has been a kind of modus vivendi between ISIS and the Assad regime. Not outright cooperation, but because their interests overlap to some extent. They have not really gone after each other hammer and tongs. And by extension then, you would anticipate that ISIS would largely leave the Russians alone, which they did until the attack on that airliner. The question is, and I've not been able to answer it to my own satisfaction, is did ISIS Central order that attack? Or was it a case of an affiliate getting out ahead of Central and doing something that then Central is like, we didn't need this. I think it's more the latter, actually. My discussions with people in our own intelligence community in the United States, and also European intelligence as well, they all say that this was an attack carried out by an affiliate against a soft target without real coordination with Central. So I think it's a case of, Central wanting to, maybe we won't go after Russia just yet, and an affiliate saying, hey, we've got a shot at an airliner here because we got this guy on the inside at this airport, and they went for it.
Does ISIS consider Russia to be part of the West that they want to provoke, or not? Is it separate sort of?
They don't. Well, do they lump it in that way?
So I'm not sure entirely.
No, usually not. Usually not. Usually it's they see the United States and Europe as Rome, but sometimes
even with the Chechen component there.
They
have a grudge here, right? They have a
totally, and Russia is on every jihadist target list. But ISIS has been, it's a strategic thinker, despite its apocalypticism. And it's been careful about prioritizing enemies. So it makes sense to me that this is probably an affiliate that got out ahead of headquarters rather than something headquarters did.
Okay, last question.
So given that the Iraqi army is closing in on Ramadi and is soon to invade it, given that there's reports of salaries not being paid, given that there's reports of recruit flows coming in, drying up, martyr flows drying up, is that wishful thinking that this is really happening, or
that Ramadi's going to fall?
Well, not that all of these things, that not only are they losing territory, but that the state itself seems to be eroding from the inside.
No, that's not wishful thinking. That's certainly happening, and you can anticipate that the pace will accelerate because, for all of their brutality, they have also bought off a lot of people. And if they can't pay salaries, they can't pay off the tribal sheikhs, it becomes much harder for them to sustain their rule. The question is, though, even if their government collapses, what comes next? Who deals with that insurgency? There's still going to be an insurgent group. Even if their state is gone, they're still going to be fighting. The best we were ever able to do in the preceding decade was to take them from being an insurgent group to being a clandestine terror group. That's the best we could do with our entire military might. I don't even know who's going to be able to do that, given this problem of our allies having different priorities than we do.
So if you'll join me in thanking